The moment Victoria Whitmore saw the tattoo on the janitor's arm, she made the biggest mistake of her corporate career. She laughed. Not just any laugh, the cold, cutting laugh of a woman who'd built a $12 billion empire by never showing weakness to anyone. The kind of laugh that had crushed competitors and sent grown men scrambling for cover in boardrooms across 3 continents. But this laugh would haunt her for the rest of her life, because the quiet man mopping floors in the basement of her Chicago skyscraper wasn't who she thought he was. And when he finally spoke 2 words that made her blood freeze, Victoria realized she'd just mocked a ghost who could destroy everything she'd built with a single phone call. She just didn't know it yet. The morning had started like any other in Victoria's perfectly orchestrated world. At 38, she moved through the 42nd floor of Whitmore Industries like a shark cutting through dark water. Sleek, predatory, and absolutely in control. Her tailored charcoal suit fit like armor. Diamond earrings caught the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago like a queen surveying her kingdom. Everything about Victoria Whitmore was precision, power, and perfection. Everything except the hollow space where her heart used to beat, carved out by betrayals that had taught her the only person she could trust was herself. Miss Whitmore? Her assistant Marcus approached with coffee in a cup that bore the company logo in gold leaf. The defense contractors are here for the security briefing. Victoria accepted the cup without looking up from her tablet, where profit margins climbed like mountain peaks. Revenue projections from the Pentagon contracts? Up 23%. The classified AI project is performing beyond all expectations. She nodded, satisfied but not surprised. Victoria Whitmore didn't accept failure from anyone, especially herself. She'd clawed her way up from nothing. After her father's company collapsed in scandal when she was 25, taking their family fortune and her faith in humanity with it. Now she trusted numbers, profit margins, market share, things that couldn't betray her or abandon her when she needed them most. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the morning shadows fell across her office, or the strange electricity in the air that comes before storms. Victoria had learned to trust her instincts in business. They'd saved her from hostile takeovers and boardroom coups more than once. Those same instincts were screaming at her now, though she couldn't say why. "I want to do a surprise building inspection," she announced suddenly. "Full security sweep. Every floor, every room, every person." Marcus blinked, stylus hovering over his tablet. "Ma'am? The contractors are specifically here to review our current protocols, which is exactly why I want to see what those protocols look like when no one's expecting me." Victoria's voice carried the edge that made junior executives break into cold sweats. "I didn't build this empire by trusting reports. I built it by seeing things for myself." 20 minutes later, Victoria found herself descending into the mechanical levels of her building territory she normally left to building managers and security chiefs. The elevator descended past the marble lobbies and glass-walled conference rooms, past the executive floors with their Persian rugs and original artwork, down into the hidden world that kept her corporate kingdom functioning. The basement hummed with the kind of machinery that made civilizations possible. Servers that processed billions of dollars in transactions. HVAC systems that regulated the environment where military contracts were discussed and signed. Backup generators that could keep her building running when the rest of the city went dark. This was the real heart of her empire. And Victoria realized with unsettling clarity that she'd never bothered to learn how any of it actually worked. She moved through corridors lined with pipes and electrical conduits, her heels echoing off concrete walls. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with machine oil, honest smells, she found herself thinking, then immediately wondered where that thought had come from. That's when she heard it. A child's laughter, bright and musical, cutting through the mechanical hum like sunlight piercing storm clouds. Victoria turned a corner and stopped dead. In a small break room with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs, a man in maintenance coveralls sat at a folding table, helping a young girl with homework. The girl couldn't have been more than 8. Her dark hair pulled back in pigtails, a pink backpack beside her, chair decorated with unicorn stickers. But it wasn't the domestic scene that made Victoria's breath catch. It was the man himself. He looked to be in his mid-30s, wearing faded jeans and a gray shirt with Mike embroidered over the pocket. His brown hair was military short, cut with precision that spoke of discipline and habit. When he leaned forward to point at something in the girl's workbook, his sleeve rode up, revealing black ink on his forearm. A tattoo. Professional work. Not the kind of amateur scratching that came from questionable decisions and cheap parlors. This was art, intricate, detailed, the kind that told stories to those who knew how to read them. Victoria found herself stepping closer, drawn by curiosity she couldn't name. The man's posture was wrong for a maintenance worker. Too straight, too alert. He sat like someone accustomed to command, who'd learned to read rooms and assess threats, even while helping an 8-year-old with fractions. "Daddy, I don't understand this problem," the girl said, her voice carrying that particular mix of frustration and absolute trust that children reserve for their parents. "Okay, Emma," Mike said, his voice gentle but confident. "Let's break it down into smaller pieces. Sometimes the hardest problems get easier when you look at them differently." He drew circles on a piece of scrap paper, dividing them into sections with the kind of mathematical precision that suggested his hands were used to much more complex calculations. As he explained, the girl's face brightened with understanding. Victoria lingered in the doorway, watching this scene that belonged in a suburban kitchen, not in the basement of her corporate tower. There was something about Mike's movements economical, purposeful, with no wasted motion. The way he constantly, almost unconsciously, positioned himself between his daughter and the door. The way his eyes tracked movement in his peripheral vision, even while focused on homework. Military habits. Victoria had seen enough defense contractors to recognize the signs. "Miss Whitmore." Victoria spun to find James Crawford, her head of security, approaching with a clipboard and his usual nervous energy. He was a thin man who'd spent 15 years trying to prove his worth to a woman who measured value in results, not efforts. "The defense contractors are asking about the delay," Crawford said. But his voice carried just loud enough for the break room conversation to pause. Mike looked up, and for a moment, his eyes met Victoria's. They were steady, measuring. The kind of eyes that had seen violence and made life-or-death decisions under pressure. He nodded respectfully, then returned his attention to his daughter. But something in that brief exchange sent electricity down Victoria's spine. Those weren't the eyes of a maintenance worker. Those were Predator's eyes, controlled and calculating, assessing her as much as she was assessing him. And frowned, puffing up with the particular authority of small men given temporary power. "Chen, what's your daughter doing here? You know families aren't supposed to be in the building during work hours." Mike Chen apparently straightened slightly, but kept his voice calm and respectful. "Emergency babysitter cancellation, sir. I cleared it with my supervisor." Emma's doing homework quietly, not disturbing anyone. "Well, it's disturbing now," Crawford snapped. "This isn't a daycare center. We're discussing classified defense contracts upstairs, and you're running a kindergarten down here." Victoria watched Emma shrink in her chair, her eyes going wide with the particular fear children feel when adults argue above their heads. Something twisted in Victoria's chest, a feeling she'd buried so deep she almost didn't recognize it. "I understand, sir. When I understand," Mike said, already gathering Emma's books with movements that were somehow both resigned and dangerous. "We'll move to the parking garage. There's a bench by the loading dock." The casual acceptance in his voice irritated Victoria in a way she couldn't name. No argument, no appeal to her authority, no attempt to use his daughter to manipulate sympathy. Just quiet dignity wrapped around a willingness to sit in a parking garage so his child could finish her homework. And yet, something in his tone suggested this wasn't submission. This was strategy. A man choosing his battles with the wisdom of someone who'd fought real wars. Crawford swelled with vindicated authority. "See that it doesn't happen again. Some of us take security seriously in this building." That's when Victoria saw it. The way Mike's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger. Control. The kind of iron self-discipline that comes from situations where losing your temper gets people killed. His sleeve had ridden up further as he reached for Emma's pencil case, and now Victoria could see more of the tattoo. Black wings spread over what looked like a skull, with text underneath that was partially hidden by fabric. Military insignia of some kind, but not like anything she'd seen in the corporate defense contracts that crossed her desk. This was something else. Something darker. "James?" Victoria heard herself say, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I think we can make an exception for emergency childcare, as long as the work gets done professionally." Crawford's face flushed red. "Of course! Miss Whitmore, whatever you think is best for security." Mike looked up again, and this time Victoria caught something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Surprise, but not gratitude. As if kindness from someone in her position was unexpected, but not particularly needed. As if he was evaluating her motives with the cold precision of someone who'd learned not to trust gifts that came without price tags. "Thank you, ma'am," he said simply. "Emma, we'll be quiet." Victoria nodded and turned away, but not before catching the more glimpse of that tattoo. The wings were definitely military. She could see that much, but there was something underneath them that made her blood chill. Not because she recognized it, but because she didn't. And Victoria Whitmore made it her business to know every military unit, every contractor, every piece of the defense industry that fed her empire. What kind of soldier wore tattoos she'd never seen before? As she walked away with Crawford trailing behind like a nervous dog, Victoria found herself thinking about steady eyes and controlled movements, about a man who drew fractions with engineering precision and accepted unfairness without complaint because he was fighting a different war entirely. She told herself it was nothing. A momentary curiosity about the people who kept her building functioning while she conquered the corporate world 40 floors above. But the image of that small family in the break room lingered, along with an unsettling realization that was just beginning to take shape in her mind. Mike Chen wasn't just a maintenance worker with military training. He was something else entirely, something dangerous. And Victoria Whitmore, who'd built her fortune on reading people and situations with ruthless accuracy, had the sinking feeling she'd just made a terrible mistake. The question was, how terrible? 3 days later, Victoria found herself taking the long route through the building's lower levels. Telling herself she was conducting routine security checks, the truth was messier and more disturbing. She couldn't stop thinking about Mike Chen and his daughter. About steady eyes and controlled movements. About a tattoo that nagged at her memory like a half-remembered song. She found him in the mechanical room, replacing filters in an air handler with methodical efficiency. Every movement was precise, economical, with no wasted motion. He worked like someone who'd been trained to complete tasks under extreme pressure, where mistakes had consequences measured in blood rather than money. Emma sat nearby on an overturned crate, coloring in a book while humming softly to herself. When she saw Victoria approaching, she smiled with the fearless friendliness of children who haven't yet learned to be intimidated by power. "Hi, pretty lady," Emma said, holding up her coloring book. "Do you like purple horses?" Victoria stopped, caught completely off guard. When was the last time someone had called her pretty lady without wanting something in return? Yes, purple is an excellent color for horses. Daddy says horses can be any color in art because imagination is more important than rules. Victoria glanced at Mike, who was watching their interaction with alert but relaxed attention. The kind of awareness that came from years of scanning for threats while appearing completely at ease. "Your daddy sounds like a wise man," Victoria said carefully. "He is," Emma said, with absolute conviction. "He knows everything, even how to report it, fix broken things that other people can't fix." Something in the way she said it with such innocent certainty made Victoria study Mike more carefully. He was focused on his work again, but there was a stillness to him that suggested he was listening to every word, cataloging every tone and inflection with professional precision. "What kind of broken things?" Victoria found herself asking. Emma looked at her father, who nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent communication that spoke of practiced coordination between them. "Cars and computers and—" Emma dropped her voice to a whisper. "Sad people." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She looked at Mike, but he was absorbed in his work, giving no indication he'd heard his daughter's casual assessment of his capabilities. Sad people. The phrase echoed in Victoria's mind as she studied this man who moved through her building like a ghost, fixing things quietly and efficiently, while everyone above remained oblivious to his presence. What kind of maintenance worker specialized in fixing sad people? "I should let you get back to work," Victoria said, backing toward the door. "Miss Whitmore." Mike's voice stopped her cold. When she turned, he was looking directly at her, with those measuring eyes, the first time he'd initiated real eye contact. The intensity of his gaze made her feel suddenly exposed, as if he could see through every carefully constructed wall she'd built around herself. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the other day." Emma's been excited about doing homework in the fancy building ever since. His gratitude was offered without servility, acknowledgement without submission. It was the way one professional might thank another for a reasonable accommodation, and Victoria found it more unsettling than any amount of fawning would have been. "Of course," she heard herself say. "Children should feel welcome wherever their parents work." Mike nodded and turned back to his work, but not before. Victoria caught another glimpse of that tattoo. This time, she saw more detail wings that weren't wings at all, but stylized aircraft. And underneath, partially visible text that made her breath catch. She couldn't read all of it, but she could make out enough letters to send ice through her veins. Because Victoria Whitmore hadn't built a defense contracting empire without learning to recognize the most dangerous acronyms in the military world. And what she thought she saw on Mike Chen's arm was impossible. Impossible. Because men with those particular tattoos didn't work as janitors in corporate buildings. They worked in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that never made it into newspapers or congressional hearings. They were the kind of men who appeared in briefing rooms at 3 a.m. to brief presidents on operations that would never be acknowledged. The kind of men who vanished into hostile territory and emerged weeks later with intelligence that changed the course of wars. The kind of men who, if they decided you were a threat, could make you disappear so completely that not even your own security team would know where to start looking. Victoria walked away on unsteady legs, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to consider. Because if Mike Chen was who she was beginning to suspect he was, then everything had just changed. Her building, her empire, her carefully controlled world, none of it mattered. If she'd just threatened the wrong man's daughter, the collision was about to become an earthquake, and Victoria Whitmore, who'd always prided herself on being prepared for anything, was about to discover that some forces were beyond even her ability to control. She just had to figure out the truth first, before it was too late. The personnel file arrived at Victoria's penthouse apartment at 11:30 that night, delivered by courier with the kind of discretion that money could buy and questions couldn't penetrate. She'd called in favors that would cost her later, contacted people who specialized in finding information that wasn't supposed to exist. Victoria poured herself 3 fingers of whiskey. The good stuff, aged longer than some of her employees had been alive, and opened the encrypted tablet with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. What she found made her blood turn to ice water. Michael James Chen, age 34, born in San Francisco to first-generation immigrants who'd built a small restaurant empire through 70-hour work weeks and absolute determination. Academic scholarship to Stanford, where he'd majored in engineering with a specialty in systems analysis that had caught the attention of military recruiters. But it was the service record that made Victoria's whiskey glass freeze halfway to her lips. United States Army, Rangers, Special Forces, and then, buried in a section marked with security classifications she'd never seen before, 3 words that changed everything. First, Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta Force, the unit that officially didn't exist, that carried out missions no one talked about, that recruited from the absolute elite of an already superhuman military, the men who dropped into places that didn't appear on any map to eliminate threats that kept presidents awake at night. Victoria's hands shook as she scrolled through operational summaries so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art. Black bars covered everything except fragments. High-value target eliminated. Hostages recovered against impossible odds. Chen demonstrated. Extraordinary. The rest was classified beyond her security clearance, which was saying something for a woman who held defense contracts worth billions. But it was the final entry that made her heart stop completely. Mission status. Classified. Result. Catastrophic failure. Casualties. Redacted. Operator status. Honorable discharge. Medical. Psychological. Evaluation required. Current location. Civilian Reintegration Program. Threat assessment. Redacted. Recommend. Continued monitoring. Victoria set down the tablet with hands that shook openly now. Medical evaluation. Psychological assessment. Words that, in the world of elite special forces, could mean anything from PTSD to something far darker. What had happened to Michael Chen in whatever classified hellscape had ended his military career? And what kind of man was now mopping floors 40 feet below her corporate empire? More importantly, and this thought made her blood freeze, what kind of man had she just threatened? Because she was beginning to understand that her casual dismissal of Mike and Emma hadn't been the harmless flex of corporate power she'd assumed. It had been the kind of mistake that people in her position didn't usually live to regret. Victoria walked to her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like stars she owned. Somewhere down there, in an apartment that probably cost less per month than she spent on shoes, a decorated war hero was reading bedtime stories to his daughter while keeping secrets that could topple governments. And tomorrow, she was going to have to face him again with the knowledge that everything had changed. The morning brought autumn rain that turned Chicago's streets into rivers of reflected neon. Victoria stood in her office, watching the city wake up beneath a steel-gray sky, and tried to convince herself that knowledge was power. It wasn't working. For the first time in her corporate life, Victoria Whitmore felt genuinely afraid, not of hostile takeovers or market crashes. She'd survived those by being smarter, more ruthless, more prepared than her enemies. This was different. This was the fear of realizing you'd been playing checkers while someone else was playing chess at a level you couldn't even comprehend. "Miss Whitmore?" Marcus appeared in her doorway, tablet in hand, and concern creasing his features. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes. Your 9 o'clock is waiting." Victoria turned away from the window, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. "Cancel it. Cancel everything until noon." "Ma'am?" The Pentagon contractors specifically requested, "Cancel them." Her voice carried a note that made Marcus step backward. "I have something more important to handle." 25 minutes later, Victoria found herself descending into the mechanical levels of her building. This time, without pretense or excuse. She needed to see Mike Chen again, but now she saw him through completely different eyes. The eyes of someone who finally understood she'd been sharing her building with a predator who could kill her with his bare hands before her security team could blink. She found him in the same break room where this had all started, reading a technical manual while eating a sandwich that looked homemade. Emma was at school. Victoria had checked the bodhisattva's time obsessively, which meant this conversation would happen without the buffer of childish innocence. When Victoria appeared in the doorway, Mike looked up with the same polite attention he'd always shown. But now Victoria could see what she'd missed before. The way his body positioned itself for optimal movement, the way his eyes automatically catalogued exits and potential weapons, the coiled stillness of a man who could explode into lethal motion without warning. "Miss Whitmore," he said calmly, "is there something wrong with the building systems?" The casual question hit her like a slap. Here was a man who'd probably killed more people than she'd fired, asking about air conditioning with the same tone her barista used to discuss coffee preferences. "No," Victoria said, stepping into the room and immediately regretting it, as Mike's attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. "I wanted to talk to you." Mike set down his sandwich and gave her his full attention, and Victoria finally understood why that simple gesture had always felt so unsettling. She was receiving the focused awareness of a man trained to assess and eliminate threats with surgical precision. "I've been reviewing personnel files," Victoria said, watching his face for any reaction. "Yours makes for interesting reading." Mike's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a subtle tensing, like a weapon being readied for use. "I'm sure it does." The calm in his voice was more terrifying than any threat could have been. "Delta Force," Victoria said, letting the words hang in the air between them like a live grenade. Now Mike's face did change, but not in the way Victoria had expected. New pride, new defensive explanations, new attempt to minimize or deflect. Just a bone-deep weariness, as if she'd picked at a wound that had never properly healed. "Former Delta Force," he said quietly. Victoria found herself studying his hands scarred, calloused from his current job, but carrying themselves with the lethal precision of someone who'd been trained to kill with whatever was available. She realized with crystal clarity that the technical manual he'd been reading was positioned to be thrown like a weapon if necessary. "That's quite a career change," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Special Operations 2. This." Mike was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting flat on the table with the stillness of someone who'd learned to control every muscle to prevent detection by enemies who shot first and never asked questions. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone, and prices that could never be fully paid. Emma needed a father more than the army needed another weapon. The simplicity of the statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. No elaborate justification, no attempt to frame his choice in heroic terms, just truth stripped down to its essential core. Sanctioned violence because his daughter needed him more than his country, needed his ability to kill. What happened? Victoria found herself asking, though every instinct screamed that she was venturing into territory where civilians weren't supposed to tread. Mike looked at her with those measuring eyes. The eyes of a predator deciding whether she represented a threat to his cub. For a moment, Victoria thought he might simply refuse to answer. Men like him were trained to compartmentalize, to keep operational details locked away, where they couldn't be extracted even under torture. But then, something in his expression shifted, and Victoria realized he was making a calculated decision to trust her with information that could probably get them both killed. "Syria," he said simply, and Victoria's blood went cold. She knew enough from classified briefings to understand that Syria was where America's most dangerous operations happened, the ones that never made it into congressional reports. "We went in to extract a high-value asset," Mike continued, his voice taking on the flat, emotionless tone of after-action reports. Intelligence said it was a clean operation. Low-risk extraction. Minimal enemy presence. Victoria found herself leaning forward, despite every survival instinct telling her to run. "Intelligence was wrong," Mike said. "Or someone wanted us to walk into a trap. We never found out which." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "The team?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer from his expression. "Didn't come home." Mike's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I carried what was left of them to the extraction point and learned that Emma's mother had died in a car accident 3 days into the mission. My daughter had spent a week in foster care while I was trying to stay alive long enough to bring my brothers home." Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. "So you left." "I chose my family," Mike said simply. "What was left of it?" They sat in silence for a moment, Victoria trying to process the magnitude of what she'd just heard. Here was a man who'd walked through hell and emerged on the other side fundamentally changed, who'd traded a life of purpose and brotherhood for the simple joy of helping his daughter with homework. "The nightmares?" Victoria found herself asking. Mike's eyes sharpened. And Victoria realized she'd just revealed more knowledge than a corporate executive should possess about the psychological aftermath of classified operations. "You've done your homework," he said. And there was something almost like approval in his voice. "I make it my business to know who works in my building," Victoria replied, which was true, but not complete. Mike studied her face with the same intensity he'd probably once used to read hostile territory. "The nightmares are manageable. Emma's laugh is louder than the screaming." Solar plexus. She looked at this man who'd probably seen horrors that would break most people, who'd lost brothers in arms and a wife in the span of a week, and realized that his greatest victory wasn't any classified mission. It was convincing his daughter that the world was safe enough to laugh in. "Does she know?" Does, Victoria asked. "About what you used to do?" Mike's expression softened for the first time since the conversation began. "She knows I was a soldier. She knows I helped people who couldn't help themselves. She knows I chose her over everything else." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the fierce protectiveness of a parent who'd seen too much evil to ever feel completely safe. "That's all she needs to know until she's old enough to understand that some people have to do terrible things so that little girls can color purple horses without being afraid." Victoria felt tears threatening the prize, first time in years that her emotional armor had cracked in front of another person. "I should get back to work," she said, starting to stand. Miss Whitmore. Mike's voice stopped her. When she looked back, he was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Can I ask you something? Victoria tensed, but nodded. Why do you come down here? To the mechanical levels, I mean. This is the 4th time this week. The directness of the question caught her off guard. No employee had ever questioned her presence anywhere in her building. Most people barely dared to make eye contact. I like to understand how things work, she said, which was true, but incomplete. Mike tilted his head slightly, and Victoria had the unsettling feeling that he could read her motivations as easily as he'd once read enemy positions. And do you? Understand how things work? It was a simple question with layers underneath that Victoria was only beginning to comprehend. She found herself answering more honestly than she'd intended in years. I'm beginning to think I don't understand anything at all. Something shifted in Mike's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition, as if he'd once stood where she was standing, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. Understanding usually starts with admitting, you don't know, he said gently. It's the hardest part, but also the most important. Victoria nodded and started to leave, but his voice stopped her at the doorway. Miss Whitmore, if you ever want to know how something really works, I'm usually down here around this time. Emma likes having someone new to show her coloring books to. It wasn't quite an invitation, but it wasn't quite not an invitation either. It was the offer of something Victoria hadn't experienced in years. Genuine human connection without agenda or ulterior motive. Thank you, she said softly. I might take you up on that. As Victoria rode the elevator back to her marble and crystal world, she realized that everything had fundamentally changed. Not just her understanding of Mike Chen, though that had been earth-shaking enough, but her understanding of herself. For 15 years, she'd built her identity around being untouchable, unreachable, protected by layers of wealth and power that kept the messy, dangerous world at bay. She'd convinced herself that isolation was strength, that needing nothing from anyone made her invulnerable. But watching Mike Chen choose love over glory, fatherhood over purpose, quiet dignity over the respect that came with being one of the world's most lethal men, Victoria began to understand that she'd been confusing loneliness for independence, and for the first time since her father's betrayal had taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, Victoria Whitmore found herself wanting to learn what it might feel like to be genuinely known by another human being, even if that human being could probably kill her before she hit the ground. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The next morning brought clarity in the form of autumn sunlight streaming through Victoria's office windows. She'd spent the night thinking about choices, the ones that defined us, the ones that haunted us, and the ones that showed who we really were when everything else was stripped away. She'd also made a decision that would have seemed impossible 48 hours ago. Victoria Whitmore was going to have lunch with a janitor and his 8-year-old daughter. At 11:45, she descended to the mechanical levels, carrying a bag from Chicago's most exclusive delicatessen. Truffle sandwiches, artisanal chips, imported sparkling water in bottles that cost more than most people's hourly wage. She found Mike in the break room, Emma beside him working on math homework, while he read maintenance manuals with the focused intensity of a graduate student. Miss Whitmore, Mike said, looking up with surprise that quickly shifted to wariness. Is everything all right? Is everything all right? I brought lunch, Victoria said, and immediately felt ridiculous. When was the last time she'd brought anyone anything that wasn't a merger proposal or termination notice? Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. Fancy lunch? With the pretty lady? Daddy, Can we share our table? Mike's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, then sharpened as he studied Victoria. She could see him calculating, assessing, trying to determine what game she was playing and what it might cost him. "That's very kind," he said carefully. "But you don't need to." "I want to," Victoria interrupted, then blinked in surprise at her own words. "I mean, I'd like to, if that's okay." Emma was already clearing space on the table, chattering about the drawing she'd made that morning, a purple dolphin wearing a crown, because dolphins should be princesses too. Mike watched Victoria unpack expensive food in cheap containers, his eyes missing nothing. "This is unexpected," he said quietly. "A lot of things have been unexpected lately," Victoria replied, meeting his gaze directly. They ate lunch together, a billionaire, a decorated war hero turned janitor, and an 8-year-old girl who treated them both like the most important people in the world. Emma regaled Victoria with stories about school, about her best friend Madison, who had a pet hamster named Sir Whiskers, about the book she was reading, where a princess saved the night instead of the other way around. Victoria found herself genuinely laughing, not the practiced corporate laugh she used in boardrooms, but real amusement at the pure joy of a child who saw magic everywhere she looked. "Tell Miss Victoria about your daddy's special job," Emma said suddenly, and both adults froze. Mike's expression went carefully neutral. "In a tween seven. Emma, we talked about this." "But she's nice," Emma protested. "And Daddy always says nice people deserve to know nice things." Victoria looked at Mike, seeing the internal struggle play out across his features. He was a man caught between protecting his operational security and his daughter's innocent desire to share the pride she felt in her father. "Your daddy did very important work," Victoria said gently. "Work that helped keep people safe." Emma nodded vigorously. "He was a hero, but now he's my hero instead of everyone's hero. Which is better because I don't have to share him." The simple statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. Here was a child who understood, in the way that only children can, that love was a choice that required sacrifice, and that the greatest heroes were often the ones who chose small, private victories over public glory. "Your daddy is very lucky to have you," Victoria said softly. "I'm the lucky one," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved me in ways she'll never understand." After lunch, Emma went back to her homework, while Mike and Victoria cleaned up in comfortable silence. Victoria found herself studying this man who moved through the world like a ghost, wondering what it would be like to trust someone that completely. "Can I ask you something?" "Quote, well, brud," Victoria said, as they threw away empty containers. Mike nodded. "The nightmares you mentioned, do they ever go away?" Mike was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the cleanup tasks. "The bad ones fade," he said finally. "But some dreams are worth keeping, even if they hurt." "What do you mean?" Mike looked at Emma, who was humming softly while working on multiplication tables. "I dream about my team sometimes. The men who didn't come home. In the dreams, we're all together again, and everyone's safe." He paused. "I could probably make those dreams stop if I worked at it. But then I'd lose the last place where my brothers are still alive." Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. "So you carry them." "I carry them," Mike confirmed. "And Emma carries me. That's how families work. We hold each other up when the world tries to knock us down." Victoria thought about her own dreams, corporate conquests, hostile takeovers, board meetings where she demolished opponents with surgical precision. When had she started dreaming about destruction instead of creation? "I should get back," she said, but made no move to leave. "Miss Victoria!" Emma called out. "Do you want to see my drawing?" Victoria approached the table where Emma had been working on a new picture. This one, showing 3 figures standing together under a rainbow. A tall man, a shorter woman in what looked like a fancy dress, and a small girl holding both their hands. "That's Daddy, and that's me, and that's you," Emma explained proudly. "We're a team now." Victoria stared at the drawing, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. When had anyone last thought of her as part of a team instead of a threat to be managed? "It's beautiful," Victoria whispered. "You can keep it," Emma said generously. "Teams should have pictures to remember the good days." Victoria accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. A child's artwork, worth nothing in any market that mattered, and yet it felt like the most valuable thing she'd owned in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "I'll treasure it." As Victoria rode the elevator back to her corporate kingdom, she carried with her more than just a crayon drawing. She carried the beginning of understanding that power without connection was just elaborate loneliness, and that the strongest people weren't always the ones who stood alone. She also carried the knowledge that 40 floors below her executive suite, a decorated war hero was teaching his daughter that multiplication tables could be fun if you made them into a game, and that love was the kind of strength that could survive anything, even the end of the world. For the first time in 15 years, Victoria Whitmore was beginning to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. And it was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The crisis began with a phone call at 3 in the morning. Victoria jolted awake in her penthouse, the sound of her private line cutting through the silence like a blade. Only 5 people had that number, and none of them called unless the world was ending or about to. "Victoria!" The voice belonged to Senator James Mitchell, chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee, and a man who'd never met a classified briefing he couldn't monetize. "We have a problem." Victoria sat up, instantly alert. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves your building, your security clearance, and a certain maintenance worker whose file just landed on my desk with more black ink than a squid convention." Ice water flooded Victoria's veins. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Michael Chen. Ring any bells?" "Former Delta Force. Operator who's been playing janitor in your corporate playground while you've been having cozy lunch dates in the basement." Victoria's hand tightened on the phone until her knuckles went white. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter who. What matters is that certain people in Washington are very interested in why a woman with billion-dollar defense contracts is fraternizing with a burned asset who knows where too many bodies are buried." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. "Burned asset? Oh, you didn't know?" Mitchell's voice carried the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed watching others squirm. "Your boyfriend isn't just former Delta Force, sweetheart. He's the kind of former that comes with permanent monitoring and a file that makes people disappear for asking the wrong questions." Victoria's world tilted on its axis. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've got 24 hours to fire him and cut all contact, or I personally guarantee that every defense contract you hold will evaporate like morning mist. Your company will be radioactive, your security clearance will be revoked, and you'll be lucky if you can get a job selling insurance by the time I'm done with you." The line went dead. Victoria sat in the darkness of her bedroom, staring at the city lights below, while her carefully constructed world crumbled around her. Everything she'd built, every sacrifice she'd made, every relationship she'd destroyed in pursuit of untouchable success. All of it hanging by a thread, because she dared to care about a man and his daughter. But as she sat there, another realization crept in like dawn through the blinds. For the first time in 15 years, the thought of losing everything didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like the beginning of finding out who she really was. 6 hours later, Victoria stood in her office, watching the city wake up through windows that might soon belong to someone else. Her assistant Marcus hovered nearby, radiating the nervous energy of a man who sensed his world shifting beneath his feet. "Ma'am, the board is asking about the emergency meeting you called. They want to know what crisis requires immediate attention." Victoria turned away from the window, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on steel. "Cancel the meeting, Marcus, and clear my schedule for the rest of the day. But the Pentagon contractors can wait." Victoria's voice carried a note of finality that made Marcus step backward. "There's something more important I need to handle." 30 minutes later, Victoria descended into the mechanical levels of her building. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her walked James Crawford, flanked by 2 security guards whose expressions suggested they weren't here for a friendly chat. She found Mike in the electrical room, checking voltage readings on a panel that controlled power to half the building. He looked up when they approached, and Victoria saw the exact moment he assessed the situation and understood what was coming. "You need to come with us." Mike set down his multimeter with careful precision, his movements betraying no emotion. "What's this about?" "Security review?" Crawford replied. "There are questions about your background that need immediate clarification." Victoria watched Mike's face, seeing the micro-expressions that most people would miss. The slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of calculations being made, the way his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly as he evaluated threats and escape routes. "I see," Mike said calmly. "And my daughter?" Crawford's smile held all the warmth of a shark. "That's not our concern." Victoria saw something flicker behind Mike's eyes. Not fear, but the cold, lethal focus of a man who'd killed to protect what mattered to him. For a moment, she thought he might simply refuse to go along peacefully. "It's all right," Victoria said quickly, stepping forward before the situation could escalate into violence. "Emma's at school. I'll make sure she's taken care of." Mike looked at her, and in his eyes she saw surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been respect. "Thank you," he said simply. As they led him away, Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking that had happened years ago when her father had chosen greed over family. This was different. This was her soul finally remembering how to feel again. The interrogation room was a sterile cube in the building's security center, all concrete walls and fluorescent lights that made everyone look like corpses. Mike sat at a metal table, his posture relaxed but alert, while Crawford paced like a small predator who'd finally cornered prey too dangerous for him to handle alone. "Let's start simple," Crawford said, consulting a tablet. "Your real name?" "Michael James Chen, just like on my employment records." "Your military service?" "United States Army, honorably discharged." Crawford's smile grew nastier. "Your unit?" Mike was quiet for a long moment, his eyes tracking Crawford's movements with the predatory focus of someone calculating exactly how many ways he could kill his interrogator before the guards could react. "Classified," he said finally. "Not anymore." Crawford slammed a folder down on the table. "First, Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Ring any bells?" Mike's expression didn't change, but Victoria, watching through the one-way mirror, saw his breathing shift almost imperceptibly. Combat breathing. Preparing for violence. "What happened in Syria?" Crawford pressed. "What really happened to your team?" Now Mike did react, his hands flattening against the table with enough force to make the metal sing. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made hardened soldiers reconsider their life choices. "You want to know what happened in Syria?" Mike asked softly. "You Want to hear about good men dying because someone in a comfortable office decided their lives were acceptable losses? Crawford stepped back instinctively, finally recognizing that he was in the presence of a man who'd walked through hell and emerged with the kind of knowledge that could end careers and topple governments. You want to hear about carrying my brother's home in pieces while politicians covered their asses and classified the whole thing to protect their precious careers? The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of Crawford's nervous breathing. Victoria chose that moment to enter the room. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Crawford, you're dismissed." Crawford's face flushed red. "Miss Whitmore, I have authorization from Senator Mitchell." "Yes, I know." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "But this is still my building, and you're still my employee. Leave. Now." Crawford looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Victoria's expression convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. He gathered his files and left, the guards following reluctantly behind. Victoria found herself alone with Mike in the sterile room, the silence heavy with things neither of them had said. "You know," Mike said finally, his voice tired but not defeated. "What this means?" Victoria nodded. "Senator Mitchell made the consequences very clear." "Then, why are you here?" It was a simple question, with layers underneath that Victoria was only beginning to understand. She looked at this man who'd sacrificed everything for his daughter, who'd chosen love over glory and quiet dignity over the respect that came with being one of the world's most lethal soldiers. "Because I've spent 15 years building walls to keep people out," she said softly. "And for the first time, I found someone worth tearing them down for." Mike studied her face with the intensity he'd once used to read hostile territory. "You'll lose everything." "Maybe," Victoria admitted. "But I've been thinking about what you said about understanding what really matters, and I think I'm finally starting to figure it out." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never used. "Senator Mitchell? This is Victoria Whitmore. I have a proposition for you." The voice that answered was cold as winter steel. "You have nothing I want, sweetheart, except your complete compliance. Actually, I think I have exactly what you want." Victoria's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd built an empire by reading people and situations with ruthless accuracy. The Syria operation that went sideways, the one where Mitchell Defense Industries provided the faulty intelligence that got good men killed? The silence on the other end was deafening. "I know who you really are, James," Victoria continued. "And more importantly, I know what you did. The question is, do you want Michael Chen to stay quiet about it? Or would you prefer to explain to a congressional hearing why your company's intelligence led Delta Force into a trap?" "You're bluffing," Mitchell said. But uncertainty had crept into his voice. Victoria looked at Mike, who was watching her with something that might have been amazement. "Try me. Push this any further, and I'll make sure the real story comes out, complete with financial records, communication logs, and testimony from the one operator who survived to tell the tale." "You have no proof." "I have Michael Chen," Victoria said simply, "and unlike you, he's someone people trust." The silence stretched for 30 seconds before Mitchell spoke again, his voice defeated. "What do you want?" "I want you to forget Michael Chen exists. I want his file buried so deep it would take an act of God to find it. And I want you to remember that if anything happens to him or his daughter, I'll burn your entire organization to the ground. And in return?" Victoria looked at Mike, seeing pride and respect in his eyes. "In return, the Syria operation stays classified, and everyone gets to pretend that good men died for their country instead of your greed." Another long pause. Done. Victoria hung up and sat down across from Mike, suddenly exhausted. It's over. Mike was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What did you just give up?" "Everything," Victoria said simply, "and nothing that actually mattered." That evening, Victoria sat in the break room where this had all started, sharing pizza with Mike and Emma, while the city lights twinkled beyond the small windows. Emma was describing her school day with the animated enthusiasm of someone for whom every experience was an adventure worth sharing. "And then Mrs. Patterson said my essay about heroes was the best in the class," Emma said proudly. "I wrote about how the best heroes don't wear capes, they wear work clothes, and make sandwiches, and know how to fix everything that's broken." Victoria felt tears threatening the first honest tears she'd cried in years. "That sounds like a very wise essay." "Daddy helped me with the big words," Emma admitted. "But the ideas were all mine." Mike squeezed his daughter's hand gently. "The best ideas always are." After Emma fell asleep on the small couch, exhausted by excitement and pizza, Victoria and Mike sat in comfortable silence, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. "You didn't have to do that," Mike said quietly. "Sacrifice everything for us." Victoria thought about the empire she'd built, the walls she'd constructed, the life of careful isolation she'd crafted to protect herself from ever being hurt again. Then she looked at Emma sleeping peacefully, and at Mike, who'd given up everything to make sure she felt safe and loved. "I didn't sacrifice everything," Victoria said softly. "I just finally figured out what everything actually was." Mike turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression was completely open. No walls, no operational security, no careful assessment of threats, just a man who'd found something worth protecting. "What happens now?" he asked. Victoria looked around the break room that had become more of a home to her than her penthouse apartment. "I was thinking maybe we could find out together." Mike smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "I'd like that." Outside, snow began to fall on Chicago, dusting the windows with white that caught the light like stars. Inside, a billionaire who'd forgotten how to trust learned what it meant to be part of a family, while a warrior who'd given up everything for love discovered that sometimes the greatest victories happen in the quietest moments. Emma stirred in her sleep, muttering something about purple dolphins and brave princesses. Victoria pulled a blanket over her small form, and for the first time in 15 years felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Love, it turned out, wasn't something you built walls to protect. It was something that made walls unnecessary. And sometimes, when you were brave enough to tear down everything you thought you needed, you discovered that what you'd really needed was simply the courage to let yourself be known. The next morning brought sunlight streaming through the break room windows and the sound of Emma's laughter as she showed Victoria how to make paper airplanes with proper aerodynamic principles, a skill her father had apparently taught her using actual military aviation knowledge. "See? You have to fold it exactly right," Emma explained with the patience of someone teaching a beloved but slightly slow student. "Otherwise, it won't fly straight, and flying crooked is no fun at all." Victoria watched her small fingers work with precision that clearly came from her father's influence, and felt something warm expand in her chest. "Like that?" Emma examined Victoria's attempt with serious concentration. "Better, Daddy. Look how good Miss Victoria is getting at airplane engineering." Mike looked up from where he was reading maintenance schedules. Real ones this time, not the classified after-action reports that had once filled his days, and smiled. "Natural talent." "Speaking of talent," Victoria said, "I've been thinking about some changes around here." Both Mike and Emma looked at her with curiosity. "How would you feel about a promotion?" Victoria asked Mike. I'm thinking Director of Building Operations. Better hours, actual office, salary that reflects your real qualifications. Mike was quiet for a moment, considering. And the security concerns? Handled, Victoria said firmly. Permanently. What does a Director of Building Operations do? Emma asked. Practical as always. He makes sure everything works properly, Victoria explained. And he gets to bring his daughter to work whenever babysitters cancel. Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? Every time? Every time, Victoria confirmed. Mike looked at his daughter, then at Victoria, then back at his daughter, who was practically bouncing with excitement. Well, he said slowly, I suppose Emma needs to see what it's like when her dad has a job that matches his education. Is that a yes? Victoria asked. That's a yes, Mike confirmed, and Emma launched herself at both of them in a hug that somehow managed to encompass the profound gratitude of a man who'd been given a second chance and the pure joy of a child whose world had just gotten bigger and safer. As Victoria held them both, she realized that the most important acquisitions couldn't be purchased or leveraged or negotiated. They could only be earned through the kind of courage that came from choosing love over fear, connection over control. Outside, Chicago hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their version of success. Inside a break room 40 floors below a corporate empire, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds were learning that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't money or influence or even military training. It was simply the decision to show up for the people who mattered every day, with nothing more than the promise to try again tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.